Welcome to the Living Western podcast. I'm your host, Clayton Markser. Today's guest hails from Canada. He's a horse rancher from Alberta and a family man, and he's very dedicated to both of those pursuits. He's well versed in Western culture and deeply connected to the American Quarter Horse Association, and I thought he'd be a great fit to interview on our podcast. We've been planning this podcast for months, and we were just going to do it online, but Ryan really wanted to do this interview in person, if at all possible. So, in a trip that he was making from the U.S. back to Canada, he made a detour from his route to come here and be in person in my studio to record this. And I just want to go on record saying I really appreciate that kind of commitment to this interview. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ryan Fleetwood. My guest today is Mr. Ryan Fleetwood of Fleetwood Farms Quarter Horses in Canada. Ryan, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, what your current businesses are.
Gosh, Clayton, I'm happy to be here. Thank you, first of all. How far back do you want to go? How many generations do you want to start at?
How as far back as you want to go to give us a good perspective of your story and the story of your family and business.
My great-grandparents came to the place in which I live now with my family, wife and kids. So our kids are fifth generation in the same house on the same land where we live, which is pretty cool. And it's one of those things that I think I feel like it's cooler the older I get.
Yeah, I bet.
Somehow your heritage becomes more important the older you get.
Yeah.
And so there was always horses. There was horses involved in all the old pictures and all the stories all the way back. And I was raised by wonderful people, and my parents and my grandparents. And horses were just they were part of our everyday. You know, we grew up steeped in the tradition of having horses and horsemanship and safety around them, and all those things were part of daily life. So, gosh, I don't know how far into detail.
Was it a cattle ranch or was it always been primarily horses?
Yeah. No, I would say that probably 3 generations ago, my granddad had a herd of thoroughbred mares and raised thoroughbreds. So that would have been in like the 30s and 40s. And then later they got into quarter horses, of course, with that registry only being born in the early 40s, and primarily cattle up until when BSE hit, probably 20 to 25 years ago. My mom and I were on the place, and cows were worth nothing, and crops were worth something, and our cows were getting through the fence and going and eating the crop. And I just said to Mom one day, I said, why are we doing this? Let's get rid of all the cows and buy more mares. And she said, yeah, let's do that. Awesome. And here we are.
Can you, because a lot of our listeners may not have a background in agriculture, and you just said a specific term, which I recognize, but some folks may not, with BSE. Yeah. Can you explain what that is and what it impacted?
Well, I haven't been a cow guy for so long that I'm not sure I can explain much about cows anymore. But it was mad cow disease.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember exactly what it was called, but it was something like bovine spongiform encephalomyelitis.
You did way better than I would have.
Something like that. It was a brain thing. Yes. And created chaos in the cow industry for a while.
It did.
So aside from your quarter horse business, which we're going to get into a little bit more, how would other people know you and be familiar with you? And I'm specifically speaking about your either political or industry involvement.
Yeah. My whole life is pretty well about, I'm going to say, number one, of course, is my family. Number two would be horses. And that's almost entirely what I do. So I do some judging, I do some emceeing, I do some auctioneering, I spend some time as a clinician. All of those things in and around and surrounding the horse business. So, yeah.
How about you being an AQHA director? Yeah. So, for those of you who don't know what AQHA is, I'm going to just start off right away clearing that up. It's American Quarter Horse Association. Yes, sir. When did you start? When did you get involved in being on the board?
Gosh, so I think if I go back a little bit past that, it's probably been, I want to say 10 years, but I'm always a little light on my estimating of time that's gone by. So probably 15 years ago, I was at a trade show and I noticed that on the itinerary, the CQHA, which is the Canadian Quarter Horse Association, was having their annual general meeting at this trade show, on one of the evenings in the trade show. And I thought, quarter horse, that's cool. I'm going to go. So I ended up going and sitting in the back of the room, and a fellow who I have actually had on my podcast, Dr. Wayne Burwash, when they were asking for nominations to become CQHA directors, he said, well, Ryan's here. I think that I'll nominate him. And I had no idea what was even happening.
You just
or what
showed up.
Right? And when a man like this man, Dr. Wayne Burwash, says, I'm going to nominate you, you don't say no.
Right.
So I didn't say no. And I think that probably that was the beginning of it all. Of course, the Canadian Quarter Horse Association exists to be able to work with the Canadian government in that country, in my country, because the AQHA can't work directly with a foreign government and, lobbying interests and those kinds of things. So I was involved with the CQHA as a director for a number of years, and then started attending the AQHA convention, which is a great time, and decided I would run for one of the positions in Alberta for directorship there, and was successful in that. And then within a few years, I was moved from my first posting on committee, on the international committee, onto stud book and registration, which is the committee that is responsible for deciding any rule changes, additions, deletions, anything to do with the genetic diseases. All of those things come through stud book and registration. So that is, of course, my area of interest, and so therefore my area of knowledge, and so it feels like home.
Awesome. So I'm going to back up a little bit.
Yeah.
We didn't really when I introduced you, I didn't really cover the fact that you're from Canada.
Everybody knows now.
Everybody knows. I should also say I really appreciate you taking a detour from your route to stop in here and at 8 o'clock at night have a podcast interview with me before you hit the road headed back to Canada. So just thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
What part of Canada are you in?
So I'm in Alberta, southern Alberta. And from the parallel dividing the two countries, it's only about 2 hours to get to my ranch.
Okay, so in relation to Calgary?
An hour and a half south and east.
Okay. All right, so you're not that far. Do you find yourself in the States a lot?
Yeah, I do. I do. So much so that sometimes your border agents pull me in and say, what are you doing here again?
Well, on that note, several years ago, in a past life, basically, I was headed to Alaska to go hunt with a couple people. And we got the bright idea that we were going to skip the long lines at the Sweetgrass border. Is that the big one?
Yeah.
And we decided we were going to go to Del Bonita. And we got there, and sure enough, there was no lines. We were the only people. And I think that was a disadvantage because coming into Canada, you would think 3 guys in cowboy hats must have been terrorists or something, because they went through our bags. So lots of clothes, gear. They went through everything, made us stand with our hands like on the hood of the truck while they just tore the trailer apart, and didn't find anything, of course. And then they just left it all scattered. And that was my worst border experience ever. And it was a lesson learned. Just because you think a border is going to be a shorter line, maybe they have nothing else to do.
Maybe they were bored that day. Well, on behalf of Canadians, I'm sorry.
The funny part was when we drove into Alaska, they were just like, come on in. And then when we come back through Canada to Sweetgrass, we weren't doing that again.
Yeah.
Got to the border and the guy was like, welcome back.
You're all headed home.
Yeah. So I don't have a lot of Canada experience, but a little bit.
Well, we're going to change that when you come up to visit, Mike.
That'll be awesome.
Yes.
So on the subject of Fleetwood Farms Quarter Horses, there's a lot of different disciplines and sub-disciplines within the horse world and the quarter horse world. What is Fleetwood Farms primarily known for? Performance horses or show horses or ranch horses? All of the above.
I don't know if you know what a can of worms you've opened up with that question for me. So, I don't think that Fleetwood Farms Quarter Horses and my breeding program fits nicely into any one category. I like to say when people ask that question, because in the modern world of breeding quarter horses, most breeders are almost exclusively in one discipline or another. They're pursuing one, goal of a certain type of performance horse, typically.
Yeah, they have a niche.
Yeah, they do. And so I guess I'm maybe going to give away some trade secrets here, but we'll see how this goes. We'll see what kind of response you get on this. When you look at the AQHA's own numbers and extrapolate that over the industry numbers, the percentage of people that compete, and I'm talking across the board, everything from the sports that we would immediately think of, and cutters, reiners, cow horses, roping horses, all the way to the stuff that we might not ever talk about, Clayton, hunter under saddle horses or halter horses. It's 12 to 14%. And so I not only like the type of horses that I raise, but I also thought, why on earth would I pigeonhole myself into this small, tiny little percentage of people that are looking for horses for whatever discipline is that they've chosen to go and be competitive on? And I got to make sure that I say when I talk about this that it's not that I think there's anything wrong with that or that there's a problem with competition. Well, we could get into a whole conversation about that. There isn't. But what I raise and what I want to do is harken back to the old versatility of the quarter horse. One of the things that made it the biggest breed registry in the world is the fact that these horses that you and I have known and loved in all of our lives are good for almost everything. And the reason for that is because what's between their ears and the way that they're put together, but mostly what's between their ears. It's their brain and their disposition and their ability to go to a little show on the weekend, get ridden down the ditch in the meantime, move some cows also, and then take grandma to church on Sunday and do all that safely. So it's a long answer to a short question, but my program focuses first and foremost on the disposition of these horses that we're creating, and then the conformation. And we could go through the list from there. But I think the most important thing is that we're creating horses for the regular person to go do whatever they want to do.
Okay. Well, since a lot of our listeners may not be involved in the horse industry, I'm going to ask some questions that seem pretty basic. And one of them is, can you explain where American quarter horse came from? What does that even mean? Some people have heard the term thoroughbred or Morgan or whatever kind of breeding. Where did American quarter horse come from?
The American Quarter Horse Association was founded in the early 40s, and of course their home and the office for the AQHA is in Amarillo, Texas. But the breed originated as a mishmash of all sorts of different breeds. There was, of course, the thoroughbred. There was some draft horse in there, some Mustang, the Spanish Barb, Arabian. There was just all sorts of different horses that they brought together. And in the beginning, they had inspectors who would actually go out and approve or deny horses for entry into that registry. And there was two pretty firm camps at that time. You know, there was the bulldog type horse who was used as probably more the rancher's type of horse, and then there was the race horses, which is where the name came from, and the quarter mile. So the quarter horse can run the quarter mile faster than the thoroughbred. So they're sprinters, right? Primarily.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, that is a perfect introduction into where that came from. I'm so glad you cleared that up. Yeah. In respect of your time, I'm going to try and keep this fairly succinct and follow a little bit of my outline because I already know that you and I could talk for 3 hours, and you don't have 3 hours to spare, and I don't need to edit another 3 hour video.
You're
So,
getting to be the 3 hour guy.
yeah, I know. So I'm just going to move on a little bit, and we'll touch on some of that. I want to touch on more of the AQHA stuff here in a little bit. You gave us a little sample of your origin. Can you talk a little bit about your childhood and what brought you as an individual into this business and I guess made you want to stay in the family business?
There's so many things. There's been it's an interesting thing as I think back over my lifetime and all the experiences that I've had that have led me to here and where I am today. You know, in no small part, a lot of that credit owed to my mother and the time that I spent with her, as she used to call it, she gave me the disease, the horse disease. You know, it's in your blood and you can't get rid of it. But she always had me well mounted. Always made sure that I was on a horse that was going to look after me. We raised some horses together, you know, all throughout my lifetime, but we just bred a few mares here and there to other people's stallions primarily. And she hauled me down the road to lessons and clinics and horse shows. And I mean, we did all of the things with horses. And I guess my life then was pretty well all horse involved, and it's just stayed there.
So you never branched out and tried any other careers or any other.
Oh, sure, I did lots of things.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. None of them worked.
You just kept coming back.
I kept coming back. I went away to college for a while, and I did a couple of different jobs, and then I bought a little old house out of the city and moved it to within what I called supper distance of my mother's house.
Oh, nice.
And so, yeah, there it is, and still live on the ranch.
Do you still live in that house?
So I now, with my mom's passing, I live in the house that my mother grew up in, and that she lived in at the time when she passed, that her parents lived in, so my grandparents lived in. And when I was a kid, they still lived in that house. So I have memories of my grandmother and my granddad in that house, and you know, all the time spent, the family gatherings and whatnot. And then my granddad's parents, whom I never met, lived in that house.
Wow. That is an amazing legacy. Yeah. You don't hear that very often. So it's pretty special that you've been able to hang on to that because as we've talked before, you know, and these are hard times and changing times, and the ability to hold on to a place for that many generations is something really special, and it's really rare. It's an incredible challenge. I don't think people around the world and outside of our culture realize how much of a challenge it is just to keep these large family ranches intact, because every time you know a patriarch or matriarch passes and it gets passed on to the next generation, there's a million taxes that get put on it. Mm-hmm. And there's usually several kids, yes, and everybody wants their piece of the pie, and by the time all is said and done, they have to sell or, you know, yep, piece it out, yep, just to be able to get through. So you are in an amazing situation, and gosh, no matter what happens, your family has an amazing legacy on that piece of ground.
Thank you. I know that I'm a very fortunate man. Yeah, in many ways.
Well, hopefully when they get older, your kids will understand.
I think so. I think so. I think they will. Yeah. I know that my home, now that not just being the house, but that place, I call it the place at which I am tethered to the earth. It's the place I'll always return to.
Yeah. Well, that's good to have. So many people in the world don't even have a concept of what that feels like. So that's part of the reason you're on here. I wanted to share that story a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the AQHA director thing a little bit. Recently, there was a huge hullabaloo, I'll call it, and you were all over Facebook being as gracious as you possibly could because the association, and I might be getting this wrong, so you can correct me, but my interpretation from everything that I read was that the Quarter Horse Association was kind of attempting to follow the same trend as pretty much everything else in the world and convert to digital versus paper files. And what I understood the conflict to be was that they wanted to change your registration from paper files to digital. And that paper certificate is such a huge part of a horse. It's part of the culture. Everybody that raises a quarter horse, that certificate with the pedigree on it is an incredibly powerful image. And it's a symbol, really. And it shows so much of the horse's pedigree, but it also has their name on it. It is very powerful. So I understand why people are so up in arms about wanting to keep that in physical form. But I also understand in today's day and age, digital makes it so much more convenient and quick to file things. And so the conflict, as I understood it, was that the association wanted to switch to digital, and everybody that I know was said, absolutely not, we don't want that. Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit from your perspective as a director? What was the idea behind it? And because I'm usually things like that, they have good intentions. I don't imagine that there was any negative intent there. It came from a good place. It came from trying to help a situation or improve something. Can you talk a little bit about what happened, what the conflict was, and what maybe some of the misunderstandings were?
Wow. Yeah, I can.
This is your chance to, like you said a lot through Facebook, and I will give you huge props. When everything was coming unglued in social media land and people were throwing insults and getting really hot, you didn't run from engaging them. You could have just ignored them like a lot of other people did, but you tried to answer them and you tried to do it with tact. And I very much appreciated that. And I think everybody did, or most everybody. Yeah, I just want to get a little bit of your story on record to say whatever you wanted to say that maybe you weren't able to share yet.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate all the things you've said and the way you phrased the question and your generosity in your comments. Thank you. Gosh, I think maybe to start with, to answer that question, we have to go back a little bit and address one of the major things that people talked about and still talk about in the attempt or the work to progress towards digital registration. And that is the way that the AQHA is governed. The AQHA is an association. It's a member-driven association. And all members have an equal opportunity to attend the annual convention, which is the place at which almost all policy is decided and voted upon by the directors and the general membership, those who are not directors. And lots of people don't like that governance model, but it is what it is. And when we all bought a membership in that association, that was the governance model. And the only way to change it would be to change it through the current model to a different model, if that's what people wanted to do. At this point, I'm addressing the constant cry that I see to do a one-member ballot vote on things like this. And I can understand where that comes from, but it just isn't the way the association works. And so for me, the only way to be involved and to make any difference is to be involved from the inside, not sitting on the outside like this, usually presenting things in a negative and detrimental light. And so I feel like as an AQHA director and a lifelong horseman and someone with a true vested interest in the way that this all goes, that I could present it with somewhat of a positive light. And this is probably a good segue to go into the fact that, I'm not just an AQHA guy. I'm not just a company guy. I believe in the association and what its job is, which in my mind, first and foremost, is as a breed registry to protect and withhold the pedigrees of the breed, more so than anything else. And when it was brought up and adopted to go to digital registration, there was a lot of outcry against it. And I understand that because, gosh, man, I get holding that piece of paper in your hands with your name on it and whatever horse you've created or bought, and it has your name on it. And that's a big deal. It is part of the culture. I have this beautiful leather-bound binder that my mother had made for me with all my horse's papers in it, and I love it. It's a prized possession. I have always said that if my house was burning down and I knew my family and my animals were out of it, I'd go back in to get my damn book of papers,
Yeah.
But the world is progressing and it's changing. And one of the things that is changing in it is how we track things. And I think that it's important to note that there's all sorts of things that are important to note. Let's start with that we can still do everything we do now on paper. Transfers, registrations, etc. can all be done on paper. When and if this goes through that it becomes digital, then the only difference is that the negotiable document goes from being physical to digital. And one of the other things I want to point out is that right now, when people send in their transfer or their registration application and they get that physical copy of that digital certification back, that information on that certificate is coming from a digital database, which is what holds all the information. The only difference is we go from having a physical piece of paper to no longer having a physical piece of paper. So the questions about safety, security, the risk of the database, etc., remain the same now or later.
Because all that information's already digital.
It's already stored digitally. Yeah, absolutely.
But the papers, the actual physical paper that goes to the horse owner is still coming through mail.
Mm-hmm.
So if it does go all digital, just like pretty much everything else that's digital, is there not a way to just print it off?
It could be printed at the AQHA on the cardstock that they currently use, or it could be printed right at home in your house on the same cardstock if you'd like, if you could buy that and print out your papers. And
is the AQHA willing to do that if they go digital? Are they willing to do that for the association members?
Yeah, I think frankly that there would probably be a cost to it, which I know people are going to be listening to this and they're going to be like, oh my gosh, there's another cost at AQHA, but that's just the reality of it. That's the truth. I think there'd be a cost to it, a nominal cost to it, as far as what I understand. I mean, I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations of the AQHA. I'm simply a director who has the same amount of ability as every other director or even member to try and have some influence on policy if we're there with a sensical, altruistic attitude to make the whole thing better. Yeah. Not just what we're after in a personal sense. And I think another thing too, Clayton, it's probably a good time to say that, and I've written this down, so this isn't new information. I truly believe that the AQHA is very reactive in the way that they deal with these storms, these hullabaloos, as you called it, that come up online. They're not, let me correct that. They haven't been proactive in dealing with that stuff. I do think that we've been able to affect some change from within to where there is a move now to become more proactive.
Because of some of these big hullabaloos, like they've seen the error. And so what I'm interpreting from that is if they had done more education and outreach up front, maybe there wouldn't have been so much misunderstanding when this got officially proposed.
That's what I think. Yeah. And that's just Ryan Fleetwood. Yes, I think so. I can't see how a more proactive approach to more education, whether that's written down or in the form of videos or how-tos, educational, just help for people to understand the wheres and the whys and the hows. I can't see that that would have done damage in any way. When you're not at arm's length to the association, which I'm not as a director, nor are other directors or other members who choose to be involved in a productive and proactive way, you get to know the whys and the hows and the wheres and the reasons why things are changing or going the direction they're going. But most people, in all fairness, and this is just the way it is, most people are at arm's length because they're busy with other things that they prioritize in their life, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But if you're at arm's length and you read something you don't understand or don't like, I'm not sure how that immediately connects to let's go and unload this, I want to use a word I shouldn't use on a podcast, storm of negativity, just roll this giant ball of it down the hill at the association because they're the guilty ones. People have to remember that the association is not following the policy that was created by the association. They're following the policy that was created by the members and the directors in the association.
I did notice that there seemed to be quite a bit of confusion. I guess maybe I didn't really understand it myself. There's people, I think, associating you with like corporate AQHA
Yes.
or vice versa. And it seems like there was a pretty big disconnect. People just assumed that you could handle things at the corporate level or that the corporate folks just controlled everything, when in reality, they're just, and this is my interpretation, the corporate folks that are in the offices, they're just acting out on the policies that you as an organization have put forth.
Have directed.
Through leadership.
Yes. Yes, sir. You're exactly right. Let's just replace the word corporate, when we're talking about corporate people, with association people.
Association.
Just because it's a member-driven association, it is not a corporation.
Right. Yeah, that was the wrong word. I guess the word I was going for was more like the office portion of AQHA versus the leadership portion of AQHA. They're different. You're not all in the same building.
And I knew what you meant. It's just that there's so much of that belief that it's a corporation, and it's not a corporation. It's a member-driven association. So anybody, you or anybody else, can get involved in any level that they would like to, up to the where I'm at, to that kind of involvement, if that's what they want. But it is an association full of employees who are putting together the policy direction given to them by members and directors of the association.
Okay, so if a lot of this big hullabaloo, we'll call it, was based on lack of information, lack of education, and you've already expressed that there needed to be more of that, is that set up within the organization that there is an education and outreach? Is there a division? Is there a person that's in charge of that? Is that what the directors are supposed to be doing? What fell off? Like where in the system did that fall off? I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm sorry. I'm just curious.
I'm just thinking of how to formulate that answer. because it's a good question. And so I'm thinking of a couple of different things. One of them is that you're right. Oftentimes I was confused as being the spokesperson for AQHA. I think for two reasons: because I was presenting it in a more positive light, and because nobody else was.
Right. You were the one that was actually talking.
The only dang one.
Right.
Right. And that's where the association, in my opinion, just my opinion, dropped the ball, because they weren't out there doing it and disseminating proper information to people like me, directors, or even to their members, to show the reasons why and how it got to that stage, which is driven through policy coming from members, right? And yeah, I mean, gosh, we could go on, Clayton, but yeah, there was a clear lack in, again, just in my opinion, that could have been headed off by just a little bit more proactivity. Where that's going now, to answer your question, is that there are changes afoot inside the association, driven through policy from members and directors, to just do better, to be more proactive. That's one thing that we've got.
With education and outreach.
With education and outreach, to do better and help people understand more. Because what I find happens is that if we don't present the proper information, people will make it up.
Yep.
And
share it.
And share it, and share it 1,000 times, and then 10,000 times. And yeah, and so yeah, you know, I feel like we're on a path now where some of these things are going to get better. And you know, and then you get into where it's not up to me anymore. It's up to the association, to Carl Stressman, who's the head of it, the executive vice president, and all of those employees, all of whom, I want to say, good people. They're really good people who are really trying hard to do it right. There's nobody there who's out to make anybody's lives worse or to try and provide bad customer service. I know everybody has a horror story about the AQHA, and I get it, because I've had the difficulties too. But that doesn't mean that it isn't evolving and progressing and getting better.
There's no way to have an organization of that size and not have hiccups.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's just a matter of, do you learn from those hiccups and try to prevent them in the future? And it sounds like, based on all the stuff that happened over the registry and the digital registration hullabaloo, there's been some lessons learned, and there's some changes afoot to prevent that kind of misunderstanding from happening in the future.
No different than anything else in our lives, Clayton. We evolve, we stumble, we make mistakes, we learn from the mistakes, and we stand up and do it over again a different way in order to get it done properly.
Right.
And I truly believe that's what the association is doing.
Well, that's good. The last thing I want to ask on that subject, was there any big misconceptions that were getting shared that you would like to set straight? You don't have to, but if you want to take this opportunity to do that, was there anything major getting shared out there that was incorrect and you just like to set the record straight on it?
I feel like we've probably already done that in addressing some of the major concerns that there were about, you know, safety, security, that kind of thing of a digital database, and that digital database exists already. It's already, you know, I don't know all the technical terms because I'm not a technical guy, but it's already encrypted and safe and looked after and backed up and all of the things it needs to be in order to be looked after. And, you know, I think probably one of the major myths, if you will, that floats around out there is that the AQHA is out to get people. And it's just not the way it is. It's not the way it is. And I say that because I'm not at arm's length to the association. And I have been fortunate enough now to meet the people and to be involved and to see the process at work. And just like any governance model, it takes too long. that's just the way it works. But it is progressing the right direction.
Awesome. Do you plan to keep doing the director gig for a while?
I guess as long as they'll have me. Sometimes with the way I talk about the AQHA, I think probably they'll throw me out on my ear. But at this point, I guess I'm still there. I've recently received an email that I will go back again to the Studbook and Registration Committee. And for me, it's not a thing I just show up for and put in my recently formed opinion since I read the information. I go through everything step by step in as far advance as I get the information. I read the rules, I study it, I think about it, I look at what we can do different to make it better. And it is an absolute honor for me. If I think back to, when I was a kid and I became conscious of the AQHA, it was this big, far away place where your papers came from, and the place that my mother did business with. And over the years, it slowly became more mine to do those things with. And now for it to not be this big, far away, unknown place, it's, some of the people that I sit on this committee with, or that I have met through involvement at convention through AQHA, they're just an honor to know, to serve with, to be around, to learn from. One of my earliest memories at convention, little story for you. One of the first conventions I went to, again, I'll reference Dr. Wayne Burwash, who's been not only a great friend, but a man who sometimes if I need a little straightening out, gave it to me.
True mentor.
A true mentor. He took me under his wing one time at a social gathering at convention. And one of the first guys we ran into was Dr. Glenn Blodgett from the 4-6s. And so there I stood, feeling about this big, not because either one of them made me feel that way, but because I was and am nobody from nowhere, Canada, a foreign country. And standing there listening to those two men talk, I learned so much more by just being quiet and listening, but kind of, a pinch myself moment. Am I really standing here listening to Dr. Wayne Burwash and Dr. Glenn Blodgett have a conversation? Yes, I am. Oh my gosh, right? Yeah. So for me, I couldn't meet a rock star or a movie star that would have more of an effect on me than people like that.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, we're going to move on now into a little bit more personal stuff. And I like to share these stories because I think every person's individual story is full of lessons that other people can glean knowledge from and wisdom from. So I'll just start with, can you talk about some of the mountaintop moments of your life?
Gosh, I really wish that I'd had these questions before.
I thought about sending them to you, but I like the impulsive answer, like the first answer that comes to you. I just like the flow of that, so I didn't send them.
You like putting people on the spot. Are we talking about mountaintop moments in and around horses and the horse business, or anything across the board?
Mountaintop moments in the life and story of Ryan Fleetwood. And I'm sure there's a lot, but just give a couple that have impacted you the most.
I wish that I was a better storyteller, and I wish that I had your memory and that I could remember all those little moments and those stories of things that happened, and be one of those guys that in the future says, in 1994, this is what I did. But I don't really have that kind of memory. The thing that comes to the top of my mind that is a thing in my heart first is the very first time I held my daughter in my arms. There was so much in that moment for me, Clayton, because 4 months before I'd lost my mother, who was an elemental person in my world. And then 4 months later, the good Lord handed me this tiny baby daughter. So I'd gone from having this wonderful relationship with this woman who was, I'm talking familial relationships, right?
Yeah.
I have a great and wonderful wife,
Yeah.
but I'm talking family relationships. I'd gone from 40 years of having been raised by and then become friends, and she was a mentor and she was my business partner and all of these things. And then all of a sudden she was gone, and I didn't have that closeness in a familial relationship. And then the good Lord handed me this daughter. And I held that baby and I bawled my friggin' eyes out. I loved her so damn much more than, I mean, you're sitting here nodding because you have your own kids and you get it. You know what I'm talking about. I had no idea. I had no idea. I loved my mom so much. And then I had a daughter, and it opened up this whole nother part that was so amazing, right?
Right.
So again, man, how fortunate am I
That's awesome.
to have had all these wonderful women, females in my life. So many of them. My grandmother, my mother, my sister, my wife, my daughters. There's others, but I just am really fortunate in that way.
Well, that was a great mountaintop moment. Now I'm going to follow that with the hard one. What was your hardest and most difficult moment, and how did you get through it?
The loss of my mother. Yeah. And maybe we can talk about that another time.
Yeah. Well, the reason I didn't send that to you and why I don't send it to anybody, but I ask everybody those two questions, is because it's fascinating to me how often most everybody that I talk to, their mountaintop moment and their hardest moment are intertwined. And you're no exception. I mean, they are completely tied together. Yeah. And I think that's important to share in everybody's story. Yes, so we'll get through that hard stuff. Can you share a couple of the most powerful lessons that you learned throughout your life? Maybe a couple things that were very profound. They changed your life, and it's something that you can share that maybe would help somebody else.
Oh, gosh. I'm going to go back to horses for a minute because my heart tells me to stop talking about family stuff right now. Otherwise, you won't have much of a guest.
Oh.
Horsemanship, to me, and what I've learned over the years from the family members I've talked about and all of the different teachers that I've had, consists of three things, and they are timing, consistency, and repetition. And with those three things, with the proper application of pressure and release of pressure as timing, you can teach a horse or a dog or a kid anything, right? But we have to remember to always do the same thing the same way over and over again with the proper timing, and anything learns. So for me, I think that I'm going to take that now from a lesson about horsemanship to a lesson about life. So there's so many things that we learn about horses, what to do and what not to do, that also applies to our lives as people. And in human interaction is so many similarities to interaction with horses. So that's something that I try to keep in mind when I'm dealing with anyone, be they two-legged or four.
Awesome. This one can get a little bit deep. We won't go into super detail with this because otherwise we'll be here for a long time. But
Are you saying I talk too much?
No. I'm saying that's a deep, kind of loaded question, and maybe it's a better question for a part two. But I guess the best way to deal with it, I'll just kind of rural Western way of life is kind of threatened right now, in some ways. And a lot of it goes back to misunderstandings, lack of education, lack of outreach. And that's part of why I started this podcast is there's a lot of people out there that they have an assumption, they operate based on a perception that they have of cowboys or ranching or horses, and it's inaccurate. And a lot of it comes from popular culture, from the news, whatever. In your world, we'll just go straight to being somebody who raises horses. What are a couple of the current kind of major challenges facing your industry? And I would say not from within so much, but as a whole.
I think that's a great question. And I also want to take the opportunity to tell you that I love what you're doing. And the way that you're putting this out there to try and bridge that gap of between, if we simplify it right down, between urban and rural folk. And that's part of the problem, is that for so long, we, people like us, have put our heads down and our butts up and got to work, because that's what we have to do. Every day, as you know, we all do the same thing. You're surrounded by your photos and mementos of your life of work, because it's part of our culture.
It's how we survive.
It's how we survive. And it's the only way that we know. It's taught generation after generation. So what we do is we get out there and we go to work, and we're not necessarily looking at what's happening in the rest of the world and saying, you know what, in order to offset the direction of this in culture, we had better start educating and bringing to the forefront the way that we, by and large, run our industry properly, respectfully, creatively, all with an eye on longevity and it going to down the road to the next generation. But instead, because I think, by and large, because we've avoided doing that, we now have this large divide between cultures of urban and rural, if that's what we're going to boil it down to. And we've kind of missed the boat. So things like what you're doing to try and get people to be involved and to understand a little bit are fantastic. Anything we can do with outreach into the education system in your country or mine, or just talking to people that aren't from our life, going to make a real difference. And then that's the big picture, I think, Clayton. And then aside from that, when you ask me as a horse breeder, I think that one of the things that the AQHA addresses, which is a great thing as far as I'm concerned, is horse welfare. And as much as I hate it, social license to operate, right? That's the coin. But I hate it because I don't want to have to justify what I do on my ranch to everybody out there. However, it's kind of paradoxical to what I said earlier about educating and letting people know and talking to people about the way we operate our lives. Mm-hmm. So we have to put our story out there to present it in a more positive light in every way that we can. And we have to look after the animals that we use in agriculture. And I'm going to talk about horses, right? We have to make sure that horse is looked after throughout their lifetime and that they're not mistreated or abused, because that's just not fair to the animal.
Sometimes people in our culture get irritated that we're kind of maybe pandering to the bleeding hearts, as some would call them. Mm-hmm. But if you don't do those efforts and you don't try to educate people, you don't try to maybe think about how you're talking about something, watch your wording, you could put the whole sport at risk.
You're right. I totally agree. And the whole, all the trickle down of the effects that would have, if that's what comes to pass, is gigantic.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to move on to kind of the conclusion of the main portion of this interview. And I hope to do another one to get deeper into stuff in the future, but you need to get headed to Canada. For the last question on this main portion of the interview, what would be your best life advice to somebody listening to this?
Holy, you asked the deep questions. I thought we were going to talk about horses.
We have. Everybody's story is important. And the whole point of my podcast, even my tagline, is I'm trying to share the broad story of the rural American West, Canadian West.
Sure.
Through individual stories, because our individual stories make up the collective story. So this is me just trying to dig into your story a little bit and your views. So yeah, what is your best life advice?
Aside from love your family, I think that the breakdown of many relationships, be they personal or professional, is unknown expectations. And when you don't know what the expectation is, it's pretty hard to meet it. So I think if more people were very direct, concise on what their expectation was, let's focus on a professional relationship because we don't need to get into personal relationships. In a professional sense, if you can say, these are my expectations, the other person can say, I can meet that, or I can't meet that, or I can try to meet that. You can compromise, but then you have a foundation established to go forward with inside of that relationship. I think that over the years, when I look at the breakdown of relationships, it is almost always because somebody didn't meet somebody else's expectation.
That they maybe had no idea of.
Unspoken expectation. Yeah. So how could you know?
Right. Clear expectation.
Yes, sir.
All right. So I'm going to kind of conclude the main portion of this interview. We're going to do a little bonus quick questions at the end. Right. But the last thing I'm just going to ask you is, if people want to get to know more about you or contact you in your AQHA director role, or they want to buy a Fleetwood Farms horse, where can they find out more about you? How can they connect with you?
Probably the best way is just look me up online. I'm pretty easy to find. Fleetwood Farms Quarter Horses on Facebook, Instagram, my personal Facebook page, or Ryan at fleetwoodfarms.com.
You missed one. He hasn't talked any about it yet, but Ryan also has a new podcast. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what your podcast is and what it's about?
Well, I wasn't sure if that was considered pirating in the podcast world, if I'm talking about mine while we're on yours.
Have at it.
All right. Well, you and I have talked a lot, and you've helped me a lot. I got to thank you for that, because you gave me a lot of impetus to just get it together and do it because you were doing it. Right. So that's been great.
We were learning together.
Yes, sir. My podcast is called The Quarter Horse Holler, and The Quarter Horse Holler is available probably in all the same places yours is, where everybody gets their podcast. But the idea of The Quarter Horse Holler is to talk about things that affect the quarter horse industry, the stock horse industry, the agricultural industry, all the people in it. And so far, I have just done an introductory episode and then an interview with Dr. Wayne Burwash, who I've talked about a few times on your podcast here today. And there's many other people in the wings that we'll have conversations with there, but it's pretty broad. I just want to talk about all of the things that concern quarter horses and quarter horse people, breeding, all of those kinds of things. So,
awesome. Yeah. Well, I will link all of that, your website and your podcast and everything, in the show notes below. Right. With that, I want to say thank you for coming on the Living Western podcast. We've been trying to make this happen for a while.
Yeah.
We're in separate countries, so we're going to do it online, and then You were so gracious to take a detour from your route back home to come over here and do this. So I appreciate it.
And you and your wife have been so gracious to me. And I thank you for asking me to be on here. And thanks for the conversation.
Well, until next time,
Yes, sir.
this has been Ryan Fleetwood of Fleetwood Farms Quarter Horses, and you're listening to Living Western. Bonus content material with Ryan Fleetwood of Fleetwood Farms Quarter Horses. Here we go.
All right.
Question number 1. If money were no object, where would you want to live? I think I know the answer to this one.
Where I live. Home.
What is your favorite brand of truck?
Gosh. Dodge.
What is your favorite music?
Country.
What's your favorite meal?
I don't know, man. I really love meatloaf and I really love a good steak. So they're both right up there.
Okay. What is your favorite vacation destination?
Texas.
What particular part?
Anywhere where there's horses.
Kind of goes without saying, I suppose. What is your favorite Western movie or TV show?
I loved Tombstone and Wyatt Earp.
Okay. On this question, I meant to ask you this earlier, but this is the perfect spot for it. As a horse person in the AQHA world, what is your opinion on all of the horse content in Yellowstone? You know, there's a lot of quarter horse, reining cow horse type content that the general public around the world has never seen before. So I think it's introduced a lot of people to a whole world. But as somebody that's in that world, what was your feelings on all of that?
I think it's great. Anytime that we can put things out there like that, I think it goes to what we talked about earlier, where we're showing how those horses are cared for, how they're valued, and I just don't see anything that's really on the negative side about it.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of negative, I think, to Yellowstone in general, as far as it's just not my cup of tea. It's got a lot of language and it's definitely not family oriented. But one thing that I will say that I really respected about the way Taylor Sheridan was writing that show, when it came to certain aspects of our culture and the horse culture, he really showed a lot of respect to the giants of our culture and having them on the show playing themselves. Gosh, I loved that stuff because I grew up watching a bunch of those guys, seeing them in the AQHA magazines, and now I'm like watching them in the arena on TV. It was just a really cool way to honor that.
I agree.
Who has been your biggest hero?
My mother.
What is the most impactful book that you have read?
Gosh, sometimes I read things that are about personal development or development of your financial house. Other times I just like to read fiction that transports me out of all responsibility and current events in life. Yeah. And so Diana Gabaldon is an author that I love. I like her books.
And the last question is, what is the most impactful advice that anyone has ever directly given you?
I know I keep going back here, but when my mom was dying, I was sitting at her bedside one of the afternoons, and it was a fantastically tumultuous time in my life because this person who had been, as I said to you earlier, elemental in my life was not going to be in my life anymore. And I was holding her hand and I said to her, "Mom, there must be something we should talk about." And she said, "Ryan, there's nothing left unsaid between us." And I want to have that same relationship with people now. I don't want to leave things unsaid. Why would we?
Right. On that note, I want to thank you again for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ryan Fleetwood.
Thank you, sir. That was great.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Living Western podcast with today's guest, Mr. Ryan Fleetwood of Fleetwood Farms Quarter Horses in Canada. This episode was a fun one, and I really appreciated Ryan's candor and his conversational ability. I also really appreciated his vulnerability when he was talking about the hard stuff and his honest opinions about the state of the quarter horse industry and Western culture in general. There's more podcast interviews coming, so please stay tuned. My name is Clayton Markser, and you're listening to Living Western. We'll see you next time.